This is how billionaires make their fortune. Now, this is just in the US, but by and large, we're going to be going over retail and consumer goods today. So, I work in private equity and I study how billionaires are made since obviously I'm on the journey to become a billionaire myself. So, if you show up to an airport without a destination in mind, that's a pretty silly thing to do. So, this is all the things that we look into and saying, hey, what path do we want to take to $1 billion? Because any way it could work. And I'm going to show you how billionaires think about building such a large company and their approach to making a $1 billion company in the consumer goods market. Let us begin. Now, I will say that market timing does play a factor in this, but it's not the only thing. To give you an example, some of the largest retailers, such as Walmart, Target, and Kmart, were all founded around the same time. And so there is a way that to say that, oh, well, they got lucky and because their timing's off, it's not going to work for me. But I'll show you some evidence to the counter. But when you think about your market, there's two different ways that you can go. So if I wanted to find a market, I'm going to decide who am I going to sell to. An example of this is called the barbell effect. Now you can see on the left here, you have people who are in very large markets, such as large consumer markets that anyone will go to, such as Costco or Walmart. They're very, very large and they sell to just about everyone, but they focus on one thing. They compete on price, not value. So an example of the barbell effect is in effect here because you have really high expensive things like Louis Vuitton bags or anything from Louis Vuitton pretty much, and then Rolex. That's an example of luxury goods. And so if I wanted to make a $1 billion company in one of these industries, I would figure out, am I going to sell to the absolute high end of the market? So let's just say, the barbell effect means if you sell either really luxury goods, so this is like price, you are going to build a big company by either selling to the absolute cheapest or the most expensive. And so it's sort of kind of like a U shape there, if you will. You can just sell to super expensive people or super cheap people. And you can compete on price or you can compete on value. But you don't want to be in the middle because most companies in the middle get destroyed, get absolutely decimated. So that's what I mean by you want to compete either on price or value, just like Rolex and Louis Vuitton. And if you're going to copy someone, you might as well copy the best. A great example of this is Amazon. Amazon actually just took Walmart's playbook and they said, we're going to do this, but we're going to do it online. So it's the same playbook, but an adjacent market. Costco, they said, we're going to take the Walmart model of how can we get something as cheap as possible, but we want to have and we want to sell memberships with this. And that's actually where a large portion of their profits come out is straight out of those memberships that Costco sells you. So that's what I say. Do I want to be the cheapest option and sell to absolutely broad market, mass market to everyone I possibly can? Or do I want to sell to very high margin individuals who can afford to pay a premium on things like a watch or like a handbag? So an example of how a counterexample of how market timing doesn't matter as much as you might think it is Tom Bilyeu. So he created a company that got sold for about $1 billion, Quest Nutrition, and I know this product very well because I survived on it in college. I was actually had these all the time, and they were definitely not the most healthy things, but they still were very, very profitable because they got me as a customer, and they actually sold through Costco. So they created a partnership and then they sold their bars through Costco. So market timing isn't everything, but it sure does help. And in the time that it took Tom to make a $1 billion company was about 9 years from founding to selling it for $1 billion. So market timing isn't everything, but it sure does help. Now I will say Tom also caught a wave. Now the quote big idea here that Tom was chasing was he saw over time people were wanting to eat more and more healthy. And so like if you were to see Google Trends, you'd see like, oh, health food is like high protein foods starting to go up. And so that's a market that I want to see. Can I capture this market and can I sell to the people who are wanting to eat healthy? So that's an example of how I'd find a big trend to be able to latch onto after I've already decided, am I going to sell to the rich or am I going to sell to the average, or am I going to compete on price or am I going to compete on value? And now let's say that I have my idea. I decided I want to sell to mass market because I want to provide as much value to as many people as possible. Then the next step is how exactly do I find a market big enough, or how do I know that my market is big enough for me to sell to? I'll give you an example. There's a guy who started a peanut butter company in the some Eastern European country. It was a post-Soviet country. And for him, it was very easy to create a peanut butter company in this area. And it was because there was no competition. And so one of the formulas that I like to think of is, one of the things that I like to think about is, this is my formula for creating $1 billion, like finding $1 billion market, is number of potential units sold times the lifetime value. So lifetime value just means how much money am I going to get from one person? So an example of this is Starbucks. Their quote lifetime value is around $13,000. So they know how much they're going to get from one customer over the lifetime of that entire customer, and the number of potential units sold is relatively high because the price point is relatively low. But you may spend $10,000 on a vacation or $13,000 on a vacation. So you may that be a one-off purchase instead of a multiple reoccurring purchase. And then I divide this by competition. So if I see an entire, now example with Quest here, he went into a market that didn't have a ton of competition at the time of its founding, and he had to make special equipment in order to make this company successful. And that was not something that other people were willing to do. So his competition was relatively low, but he had a low lifetime value, but a ton of potential units sold. And because of that, he was able to make $1 billion company. So this is how I'd find it. There's three different, this is kind of the nerdy stuff here, but there's TAM, SAM, and SOM. So total addressable market, how big is your market? Serviceable addressable market is how much do I think that I can service? And then obtainable market is how much realistically am I going to be able to obtain? So an example of this is if your TAM, total addressable market, is the entire world of, let's just say, bars, but there's only people in the US because you have to get approved or something and you can't export food for whatever reason, then that would be your total addressable market. But if I'm only going to expect to get a certain percentage of that market, so an example of this is we know that this is a bar here. This is a protein bar that is sold, but there are tons of competitors in that space. Then I know I'm not going to get 100% of the market because people are going to choose to do other things. So the meme here, at Grok, is this true? But I have an example prompt here of just simply how I'd ask it. I'd ask AI, how big is the TAM, SAM, and SOM of my business idea in this market? I'd like to build $1 billion company, and I only wanted to go into a market where I think that I can build $1 billion company into. Can I create $1 billion company in this? And this can be said for just about any type of company. So whether you're a local market or you're looking to expand, this is a good way to do that. And I actually learned the 5%. It's more of a guide, not a rule, because there are people that control 30, 20%, 30%, 50% of an entire marketplace. An example of this is Google, that controls a massive amount of search volume, for example. So you absolutely can dominate your market, but that is very rare, and you shouldn't necessarily go into a market thinking that you're going to be able to get the entire addressable market. You may just get a small chunk of that market, and that is okay. You can still build $1 billion company. Now, an example of this is if your total addressable market is $10 billion and you can just get a small 1%, 10% of that, then that's $1 billion company technically. That's just an example of how I'd approach it. So that is how billionaires are made in retail and consumer goods. Once you set up your company and you continue to build and iterate on your products, then at some point you might have enough revenue. Now, I believe Quest Nutrition sold at around $350 million in annual revenue, but they sold because an investor wants to buy what? An investor wants to buy future cash flows. And so if they see this thing is taking off like a rocket, and let's say that you sell right here, they just assume, this is your sell point, they just assume that they're going to continue to make more and more money. And so they might be willing to pay a premium for your business. That is how billionaires are made in retail and consumer goods. And if you like this video on retail and consumer goods, then I made another video about how billionaires are made in private equity.